I've heard a rumor that you can read it in a sitting. So I've been waiting to do my reading to when I have a sitting period of enough length, adequate length to be able to do it in one sitting. So Claire is here and I'm going to introduce her. I'm going to introduce Leslie. Then Claire is going to read. And there are two kinds of people. People who say, I want to read for hours and hours. If you're not on mute, please mute yourself. People who want to read for hours and hours, and people who say, can I just read for a few minutes? And Claire is one of those people. And I like both kinds of people, but I love those kind of readings that Clara prefers. So she's going to read for a few minutes, and then she and Leslie are going to chat. And then I'll come back on and field some questions from you guys if we have time, with about 10 minutes left, or 15. So that's the plan. And I'm going to start by introducing Claire. Claire Thomas is a writer from Melbourne, Australia. Her acclaimed first novel was Fugitive Blue. Claire holds a PhD from the University of Melbourne. I feel like I don't say that right, but you know what I mean. Where she teaches literary studies and creative writing. She's also just such a delight. The first 2 years she came to LitFest, people would come up to me and say, have you met the woman from Australia? And she was like everybody's favorite. And I got to take several brisk walks with her to kind of process workshops and work through some things. It was lovely. Leslie Jamison is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 essay collections, The Empathy Exams and Make It Scream, Make It Burn, a critical memoir, The Recovering, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and teaches at Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn with her daughter, who came with her to Lighthouse nearly 3 years ago. And I got to hang out with both of her daughters, and it was such a thrill. So let's give it up in a virtual way for these lovely 2 authors. And let's start with you, Claire. I'll go off camera, or you can unspotlight me.
Hello. Thank you for that, Andrea. Can everybody see me now? I feel, yeah, okay, perfect. I'm going to do a reading, not a hugely long one, as Andrea alluded to, but I'll just give you a little bit of context. It's from the point of view of my character, Margot, who's the oldest of the 3 main characters in the novel. They're all watching Samuel Beckett's Happy Days, which is a play where a woman is buried up to her waist in the earth. So that's some context. Margot is a literature professor. She's married to a man named John, and she has an adult son called Adam. So I think that's everything that we need to understand at this point. Okay. All right, I'll put that down. It seems that the woman on stage is now properly contemplating her fate. She's tired of her thwarted attempts to communicate with her husband and is talking about gravity, the fact of her entrapment, the inescapable material conditions of her existence. Good-o, thinks Margot. If I were not held in this way, I would simply float up into the blue. Someday the earth will yield and let me go. The pull is so great, yes, crack all around me and let me out. Margot recently had the extraordinary feeling of floating out of her body. She was on the selection panel for an entry-level academic position in her department, and the panel had to watch the 5 shortlisted candidates present their future research plans. Around the time a young scholar was attempting to explain the productive difference between representational literary characters and typological literary characters, Margot astral projected toward the white panelled ceiling and hovered over the scene like a harrier hawk. For a moment, she felt a blessed buoyancy, a complete untethering, as though all the talk from below could just float around her in a cooling, irrelevant vapour. But then she fell back into herself. She fell back into the room and the responsibility and the requirement to suspend her own growing disbelief about the value of all this research, all these delusional graspings towards intellectual exceptionality. That brief flight was a lovely pause, Margot thinks, but I don't want the earth to let me go. I want to be grounded. I rather like the force of everything I am weighted with. During hectic periods at the university, Margot imagined slipping into a different life, a lighter one with fewer people, fewer schedules and expectations, in which she would live somewhere remote but faintly cosmopolitan, a tree-change town where you could buy a decent jar of olive tapenade and find a well-scheduled yoga class. She'd own a sensitively renovated period cottage with great proportions. She'd spend hours reclining in a cosy bay window reading novels, occasionally looking up to admire a gorgeous magnolia tree in her effortlessly thriving large garden. She would be unencumbered. John, the old John, always featured in this alternative life, interrupting her reading to show her a curious meteorological map on his iPad, or to hand her a gin and tonic made with liquor from the local boutique distillery 15 minutes along the main road. She feels a shiver of embarrassment to realise now that Adam and his family haven't made it into her fantasy, her rather conventional image of retirement. Oh, doesn't matter. I have no intention of retiring or disappearing into the ether anytime soon, despite what that upstart of a dean might be encouraging. I don't care about an academic succession plan, about making space for the next generation of scholars. Those pressures are just fresh ways to disproportionately burden a senior female with mentoring responsibilities. I can think of several old men, grey fixtures in the faculty, who haven't developed a new research proposal or lecture in years, and I bet they're not losing sleep over the brilliant young minds who can't secure an academic appointment. I will continue with all of it for as long as I please. Margot has paused once or twice during her career to reflect on her frenetic disposition that manifests as compulsive busyness. Perhaps it is a decoy to avoid the truth of herself. She considered seeing a psychoanalyst, but she couldn't commit that many hours of her time to such a dredging, such a drudge. And she was put off by the thought of several of her younger male colleagues laden with Lacan worship, unable to have an untheorized encounter without allusions to a sublimated signification chain. So she'd seen a clinical psychologist, a man with a couple of decent degrees and a kind face, and what a waste of time that was. The psychologist told her that a person is defined, ideally, not by what they have done, but by who they are. Internal fortitude is the source of healthy self-determination, not the external affirmation of others, ideally. The psychologist told Margot she should strive to have a sense of herself that is about core values, an understanding that is not contingent on achievements or activities, or even, and this is where he really lost her relationship to others. Perhaps that would be possible if one did not achieve, if one were inactive or a hermit. So she imagined being someone without a professorial chair, someone who had not written several books, someone who had not won many prestigious awards and grants for her work, someone who did not have friends and colleagues whose good opinion she craved, someone who did not get invited to speak at international conferences, someone who did not have institutional and cultural power. And those erasures were only momentarily tolerable before she felt panicked and bereft. She grappled as instructed. Yes, that's what she did, bloody well grappled with the psychologist's notion and tried to accept it. But it was horseshit. How is anyone able to differentiate between the being and the doing? If I do nothing, aren't I also nothing but a passive repository for my intellect and emotions and bodily functions? Doesn't the doing activate the being and give it form? Ha, said the clinical psychologist. You are not the first high-achieving person to suggest that to me. Smug bastard. So she made it simpler for him. The components of my life cannot be deducted like fructose or gluten in some sort of elimination diet. I don't believe in an ideal core of healthy selfhood that will only thrive once we get rid of all the superfluous things that might be damaging me. Get it? Oh, he got it. And that was several years ago when Margot's life was so fundamentally unproblematic that she was able to define her own hyperfunctionality as a problem. If Margot had seen the clinical psychologist more recently, would she have told him about her career confusion, her husband's illness, about her son's contempt? Would she have made a point of wearing a sleeveless top to the consultation in the hope that he might be the only person ever to ask her about those awful bruises on her arms? And might she have just told him the lot and cried and listened to the sound of her own voice saying out loud all the shameful thoughts that were whipping uselessly around her brain? Does she need to hear it all said out loud? On stage, the woman has picked up a parasol. She's fiddling with its mechanics and is unsure whether now is the right time to open it. She's unsure whether she should further endure the heat until she becomes even more desperate for the shelter of the parasol. She is unsure whether prolonging the opening of her parasol might help her to get through the day. Perhaps it is just too soon. Oh, put the damn thing up and protect yourself, Margot thinks. What on earth are you waiting for? That's it.
So lovely to hear you read it.
Thank you.
And so lovely to be here with you as Andrea mentioned, Claire and I first met, got to know each other at Lit Fest 3 years ago. And yeah, I remember it well because my daughter was very young, but it was also and right down the street. But it was also, it was such a special group and so wonderful. You know, the minute that Andre emailed me about this, I was like, I had such a strong memory of you as a person for all the reasons that Andre was describing, but also just your voice on the page and the writing you shared. It was a nonfiction workshop, and hopefully at some point in this conversation, for selfish reasons and curious reasons, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the relationship between fiction and nonfiction in your life. And I think that's partially on my mind because that was the context in which we met. But I was just so thrilled to encounter your voice on the page again after these years and in the form of this beautiful, beautiful book. And so it feels so right to be talking to you about that book in the under the digital awning of the Lighthouse community once again. So anyway, congratulations. It's so wonderful to be hurling our voices at each other across an ocean, and so lovely to see these other folks gathered here. And thank you, Andre, for hosting us. And I mean, I thought I would just jump right in with a question that you can take wherever you want, but you know, the frame and structure of the book is so distinct, and I think really unlike any other novel that was coming to mind, at least as I read it, where the entire court, I mean, there's a kind of I'm probably gonna like misparaphrase Aristotle here, but there's like a unity of space and time and action where the whole novel takes place during a single theatrical performance. We track these three characters who I'd love to talk about each of them more in depth, but I'm curious just how you arrived at this structural frame to contain everything in, even though we follow associations outside of it, to contain everything within this performance, what that allowed you to explore, whether it felt like a kind of freeing generative constraint, whether it ever felt just constraining, like, you know, both what took you there and then what it was like to work within that structure.
Thank you. And I reiterate all that lovely stuff you said about Lighthouse, and that was a transformative experience for me, and particularly the weekend in your workshop, but we can maybe talk about that later. But it is beautiful to be here with you too. So yeah, the concept of kind of writing a novel from the point of view of people watching a play was an idea I had a very long time ago. And I sort of was quite taken with the idea. I thought, oh, that's very high concept. That'll be interesting. But I couldn't, and I sort of sat on it for years and years. And I didn't quite know how to proceed with it. Because as you say, it could have just been too enclosing. But ultimately, when I just decided to actually start, it was paradoxically incredibly freeing, because I find that it's very helpful for me to have a kind of macro structure, but then within that, I went all over the place. So, but then there was grounding. And my first novel had a macro structure. The thing I'm working on now has got a macro structure, and I've just kind of resigned myself to the fact I think that I that's how I'm going to roll. But I did kind of break down the play into sections and work out which character was going to sort of be watching each part. And then I let that go in the writing quite a lot. As you can see from that section I read, it does sort of go all over the place. But yeah, so as you say, I also wanted to replicate the experience of sitting in the theatre, so that it's, I don't know if you can read it in real time, but it's not far from that, in that it's almost like you are also watching, you're experiencing the same thing at the same time. So it's quite literal in that sense.
Yeah, I found it to be incredibly immersive. I mean, as Andrea said at the beginning, that she'd heard a rumor that you could read it in one sitting. I did, and in that way, it does sort of create this immersive world that you live inside of. But as you say, it never you follow each of these characters into so many different parts of their past, so much of what is putting pressure on them or troubling them or creating urgency in their lives outside the framework of the theater. So it never feels enclosed in that way. And in a way, it's a very generous reading and accurate of what it actually feels like to be in a theater, where sometimes you feel like you're the only one who's thinking about, a thousand other things as you're watching the play. But of course, you're never the only person who's thinking about a thousand other things as you're watching the play. And this novel sort of honors that profoundly and structurally. I'm curious whether it was always this play, Beckett's Happy Days, and kind of why it's important to you, or what it did for you to use this play.
It certainly started with this play, and there was
And tell us a little bit more about, I mean, you mentioned the sort of crucial fact of the woman buried, but
so it is a very stunningly simple concept. The play is entirely about a woman who is buried in the earth, and it is her speech and her thoughts and her memories and her day-to-day kind of endurance of this predicament. There is her husband who kind of ineffectually crawls out, grunts at her and goes back, but it's absolutely her voice is central. And she covers an incredibly broad range of themes and thoughts and ideas. So the play, yes, I always wanted to do this play because it's got a certain the stage business is very simple. So it made it, I didn't have to explain too much what was going on stage. It's really, it's just there's two characters, they're very clearly delineated. There's no business, there's no moving around. And so there was that sort of simplicity to it. And there was one point before I really got into it where I was having second thoughts about the play, just because I wanted it to be a female playwright, but I got over that. And then also quite beyond the practicalities of the stagecraft, just that image of a woman buried, it just, I think, is the most symbolically rich kind of theatrical conceit I could have imagined almost. So yes, and there was so much in it that I didn't really use very much the play proportionally, but I just kind of could pick out what I wanted to roll with, and the same play could have been engaged with by someone else, and they would have chosen a completely different theme, a completely different emphasis.
Well, and part of what's so compelling about the ways that your three characters are sort of encountering the play is that each of them in turn is sort of paying particular attention to different features of the play itself. So we're sort of seeing it, we're seeing not only the kind of narrowed gaze on what's happening on stage, that what the novel has chosen to represent, but we're sort of getting to know each of them through what they're particularly keyed into, and in that way it feels like, of course, one of many things that the novel is doing is exploring how we relate to art, what art does to us, the various ways in which it does those things to us, how it sort of disrupts us, how it disturbs us, how we find ourselves in it, how it kind of puts pressure on the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. I mean, I was sort of really responding to that aspect of getting to watch these three women encountering this particular art. But I'm curious sort of what you were hoping to explore with the novel in that way, in its vision of how we relate to art or what art does to us.
Yes, and I think there's a particular quality to theatre that is both communal, and that's and there's a sort of tenuousness to theatre, that it's so live and anything can happen either on stage or in the audience. and so there is this sense of a communal shared experience, and all the ways that that can manifest, and some of the little stuff like being sort of having this false intimacy with strangers and feeling them or smelling them, and I kind of liked all that. But then, yes, of course, they're not watching the same thing, and so there is obviously, this is just kind of subjectivity 101, but that's what I was interested in, that the kind of the different preconceptions and the different ways in which they are engaging with what is essentially the same moment in time, and the tensions of that communal experience that is very individuated at the same time. And also they've got different relationships to Beckett, and they, you know, one's quite a fan, and Margot, the professor, she's a bit dismissive. She's very secure in her worldview. And then the younger character's an usher, and she's also an acting student, and she just thought Beckett was all crusty old man complaining about dying, and so she's found this play quite a shocking revelation. Yeah, so that was fun to kind of take it in from those different person perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the sort of the play as this not only this kind of the drama of this, I loved how you put it, the kind of tension between the individual experience and the communal experience, but then also even what as you were saying earlier, just like the stark, sort of searing, alternately horrifying, absurd, grotesque, comic imagery of this woman, you know, buried underground, just like what the idea, or kind of iconic, almost like kind of saturated symbolism of a buried woman means to each of these women too, and is really, you know, it's as you say, it's not one thing, it's not monolithic, it's quite rich and layered, and certainly my experience with each of these characters was sort of having, as with anyone or anyone worth knowing, having this sort of initial sense of their contours that then gets deepened, inverted, you know, they surprise us. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us, you know, for those of the people who haven't read the book, and for those who have and already love these characters, just tell us a little bit about each of these three women, and sort of how you came to them, and what you wanted them to do as a kind of triptych, as a trio in this book.
Yeah, so it's a cross-generational situation. There's a 20-something who's, I mentioned before, who's working as an usher in the theatre, and she's an acting student. Her name's Summer. She's the second character we meet. The first character we meet is Margot, who's the 70-something literature professor. I started with her, and that I sort of started with her more as a mirror of Winnie, but actually she's much older than Winnie is. But so Ivy was the start, and then I wanted to have someone who wasn't a straight up audience member, so that's how I got to the usher and a younger woman. And then I thought, well, let's do three generations, and so then I did an early 40-something, and her name's Ivy, and she is a philanthropist who has been given free tickets to the play, even though she's got all the money in the world but the theatre company wants more of her money, so they're giving her things for free. And she is the one who's quite a Beckett fan, and sort of, the evolution of how their characters formed is so complex. I'm not sure I could unpack it all, but I wanted to, I was intent all along on having ambivalence and misconception, and so they're not exactly what they think, how they appear to be, and so choices around their lives and their stories and their memories, a lot of them were around, sort of, as you said, kind of undercutting the assumptions that
Mm-hmm.
we all make about everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but we also make about characters when we first meet them. So I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
kind of play around with that.
Yeah, and there's this brilliant thing. It's only just coming into focus for me structurally as you were saying that. But one delightful thing that happens in the novel is we do get an intermission. I don't mean we need or want an intermission from the novel, but just that there's like the. I mean, I'm not telling you this because you know what you did, but for everybody else here, the intermission section is sort of told as if it were a play with stage instructions and dramatic dialogue. But one thing that happens in addition to the sort of, clever inversion of like moving from prose narration to, an actual dramatic script during the period of the novel when the play is not itself happening, is that in relation to what you were just saying, we sort of get this experience that's when the characters meet, is during the intermission, and some of them have a history, and that's an interesting part of it too. But it's almost like as we've been in this process for the 150, 200 pages preceding the intermission of this like deepening relationship to each character and the sort of overturning of what we thought we knew, we get to sort of see them through the eyes of the others once again in this kind of first impression, more on the surface way, but that we now as readers have all of this kind of depth understanding underneath as we see them encounter each other's surfaces.
Yes, and I think that the play script itself is quite minimalist, and it only works because, well, it works. I
think it works.
Because of all the deft things that come before. Because we know the characters so well, so we know them better than the other characters know them. So when they're suddenly flipped around, we've been like deeply kind of in their heads, and then it's flipped, and we're just watching them move across space. We're watching them, move around, and the minimal dialogue and the minimal encounters, where we can fill all the content in. So we're like, that might be, I wouldn't have thought Ivy would react that way, or that's very Margot, or so there's that's what I was hoping to do there. And that there's a certain sense of playing with reality and what feels more real to a reader. Is it when you are immersed in the internal thoughts, or is it when you can just watch them as bodies, and the disconnect between that and the kind of that relationship between what's within and what's external, and the porousness of that. Something that I'm very interested in. Yeah.
And which connects in a gorgeous way to the section that you read aloud, actually, and Margot grappling with her therapist, sort of always harping on the idea of a core essence inside of us, and Margot essentially being like, well, that's bullshit, because identity isn't the core essence that's like sitting inside of us. It's how that expresses that, in a sense, even if we don't want to think it's the real self that's like bumbling in the hall or saying the wrong thing to the stranger, like that is real as well. Like our relational being in the world selves are, just as much us as the sort of pure mind that's free associating and, in the scene.
Yes. And that this question of performance, that they kind of operate in the world in a certain way. They all have different roles that they play, obviously, in their own lives, but also I think and just this idea of what's true, that they also are performing in their own minds, that they tell themselves stories about themselves that become a kind of artifice as well. And they break down a little bit in the course of the play. But so the kind of self-delusion is as present as, public facing delusion, or, turning it on for an audience.
Yeah. And somebody recently in another context was talking about sort of, she used this wonderful phrasing about sort of looping in, I think she was talking about a partner, but like looping somebody into her self-delusions. And I was thinking about how we sort of like CC others on our self-delusions or something like that. But it's the way that that connection between how we delude ourselves and how we delude others is really intricate and often vexing. And it strikes me as you're talking, I won't give too much away about each of these characters, but that each of them is sort of wrestling with something that they're struggling to fit into their narrative of self. Like, you know, for Margot, the bruises that show up quickly in what you read are sort of part of that kind of, how do I fit this aspect of my life into my larger narrative of self? Summer, the young usher, is sort of trying to figure out something pretty big about her origins, that she's trying to, you know, kind of figure out how that missing jigsaw piece fits into her sense of self. Like they're all sort of trying to, it's like there are these chinks or fissures in these self narratives that they're, you know, that are coming undone a bit. Yeah.
And Margot's is probably the most solid, because she's been operating in this kind of space her whole adult life, and she's authoritative, and so she fancies herself as someone who can control the way she thinks, and she's a professional thinker, you know, that's what she does. Whereas I think with Summer, she hasn't got a it's not even that her sense of self is fracturing. It's almost like she hasn't quite nailed it down almost on any level yet. She hasn't worked out the world to kind of latch onto, and what in the world to discard, or how much to let everything kind of impact her, or how so she's much more fluid, I guess. And then Ivy's had to kind of remake herself over and over throughout her life, and she's probably okay at the moment. She's in a kind of good spot, but knows that that's not necessarily going to last.
Right. She's led a life that makes it hard to trust good spots when you're when you're in them. I mean, and well, I have a million things to ask you, and I'm going to ask you a few more, but then maybe I imagine lots of folks here have things to ask, and I want to make sure to leave some time for that as well.
Okay.
But one thing that I was going to pick up on, you know, one of the things that delighted me most when I was reading this novel, which is a feature that you alluded to earlier when you were talking about the kind of communal aspects of going to the theater, and how you're in this space with all of those other bodies, which obviously has a, you know, particular resonance for all of us in this ongoing pandemic moment, but the way that you're sort of aware of how other people smell and their sounds and all of those things are not, you know, if you're kind of, I think, viewing the experience holistically, those aren't like disruptions or obstructions of the experience. They are themselves part of the experience. And I loved reading about, you know, kind of snoring and the kind of jostling for the armrest, which, like, anybody who has ever shared an armrest with another human being, is like, oh my God, you could write an entire book just about the armrest.
Oh yeah.
The gender dynamics of the armrest tussle, all of it. But I would love to talk a little bit about, you know, sort of writing those very, very physical bodily dimensions of this book.
Yeah. I was very determined, because it was all cerebral in a way, because it's all just thoughts. I really wanted the bodies not to be forgotten. And I was very concerned about embodying everything, so that kind of took the form, of emphasizing their body in this space, in this moment. And you know, Margot's got a cough at one point, and another person in the audience is glaring at her, and you know, it's also about these assumptions that you make about other people when you're proximate to them. And you know, if someone's got their hand, you know, their elbow on your armrest, well then obviously that person's, you know, a terrible human being. So I've liked the idea about the kind of quick judgments that we can make when we are kind of close to other people. I'm not sure I'm answering it. I can't remember what I was.
Oh, you're answering it perfectly.
Yeah, and then I think also in the memories, I wanted it to be, there's a lot, as I sort of alluded to before, there's a lot about what's contained and what doesn't get held in. So there's a lot of bodily fluids kind of throughout the book in various forms that are not being properly managed, you know, and there's this sense of that stuff should be away. And even one of the characters is crying at some point, and she doesn't realize she started crying, and she's very disappointed and annoyed with herself that she's accidentally started crying in a dark theatre. So yeah, I kind of wanted it to be very, and then of course Summer's in a sort of panic attack, anxiety moment a couple of times, and I was hoping that the reader can feel each of these sort of bodies in turn, like now I'm sitting in Margot, now I'm sitting in Ivy, now I'm sitting in Summer, because that's how I felt when I was doing it.
Yeah, you really feel in this novel that kind of thrilling, almost the way that a roving narrator in a work of fiction can actually be a sort of form of demonic possession or something like that, where the reader is the demon, right? Where we are, when you put it that way, like sitting inside each of them. But I think that all of that bodily specificity, the sort of the way that we feel the tickle with Margot of the cough, and the tickle is compounded by the anxiety of like, okay, will the person in the next row look back again at the slightest sound? And I think anybody who's passively aggressively been proffered a cough drop in the past knows that sort of the way that one's own body can feel like this aggressive element in space. And of course, when you have a stage set that's like every physical dimension of the production is being controlled, it kind of thrusts into relief the way that things like bruises or coughs or all these parts of the body, the tears that we can't control, are like where, again, it's like, where does truth live? Like kind of in the act we put on, and then kind of in all the things that spill out or
leak out.
Yes.
And even the tattoos were sort of, there's a tattoo aspect to it, and that kind of deliberate kind of using the body as a kind of canvas, and at one point the bruises are kind of related, or Margot tries to think of her bruises in the sort of same way that Summer thinks about her tattoos as kind of shapes and color and art on the skin. But
yeah, well, and there's actually a way, I won't detour too long on tattoos because it's something I could talk about for a long time, but one thing that sometimes becomes interesting about tattoos is the way that the sort of shameful tattoo from youth actually becomes more like a kind of bodily, like an embarrassing bodily secretion, where it's sort of like the weird fuzzy thing that you like got when you were 21 or something is like still lives on your body. It's like you might want to contain that self that chose to get that tattoo, but your body can't contain it.
But it's kind of like then it becomes like externalizing of a memory, and that's not and then it's too visible.
Yep. Well, I'm gonna ask, I could ask you questions all night. I'm trying to put in the chat, and I will echo summon all of your questions, all of you here. I'm gonna ask one more before I sort of turn it over to Andrea and the rest of you, but I could ask 1,000 more, and it's related to what you were saying earlier about Summer's the young usher sort of is in a state of heightened anxiety through the entire performance, that then sort of bubbles over into a few anxiety attacks, and part of it is, the majority of it is connected to her girlfriend's family home is being threatened in a fire, and there's this way, I mean, the entire novel is pressurized by these fires that are raging outside the theater, and pressurized by kind of climate crisis in this larger way. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, I'm really interested in the way that climate crisis is showing up in a lot of fiction. Recently, I did an event last month with Madeline Watts, another Australian writer, and Betsy Colbert, and both of whom are writing about climate crisis in different ways. I also, really love Jenny O'Field's book, Weather. And part of what's so fascinating and challenging, I think, about writing climate crisis is just doesn't live on a human scale. So how do we approach it with a human scale? So I just love to hear you talk a little bit about kind of bringing writing into climate crisis in some way, or bringing that environmental catastrophe into this book.
I felt that it was definitely something that I wanted to include in a contemporary moment, but I'm not someone who can write a genre or a sort of dystopic futurist. I didn't want to displace the climate crisis into something that was still coming, that was in the future. But I was also wanted to explore the individuals' responses to it. And so the idea of them being trapped in the, being stuck in the theatre while there are bushfires burning outside, I hoped would be a kind of resonate with the idea of just the futility of individual attempts to solve this thing. And they all have different attitudes about it, like everything else. But and Summer's one of just horror, and even just regardless of the fires and her girlfriend's potentially in danger, she's already really delineates all sorts of stuff that she just can't. To her it seems so obvious, but there's a disconnect to the wider world's understanding. But to Summer, it's like it's very obvious, and I think that is a common experience for people of her generation. And Margot sort of doesn't. She says at one point, "Oh no, we're not talking about the planet. Don't start talking about the planet." Like she just deflects it. And then Ivy, because she's got money, she's kind of in a place where she can be more practically and proactively useful to an extent. So I guess it's not cli-fi in the kind of, I didn't put the characters in the catastrophic moment, but it's more about how they perceive the moment, just the present, this moment in time. I wanted to capture that and acknowledge that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think there's something so resonant about the kind of simultaneity of watching the performance while the fires are raging, because on the one hand there's something unthinkable about it, but at the same time it's what we're all doing every day. We're watching, we're doing whatever while the fires are raging.
And how much is that an appalling denial, to sit in this bubble of culture and this comfort, and how much of it is just inevitable human functionality. You can't, so it's that sort of balance between engaging and being consumed.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. Well, Andre, what I know, I can see that there are people with questions even showing up in the chat. So I will turn it over to you to let them speak.
Well, thank you. And if anybody wants to actually ask their own questions, speaking of, doing other things while the world's on fire, here we are, doing this while the world's on fire. And so if anybody wishes to be spotlit and be in the picture, please let me know. But otherwise, I'll just posit the questions. Mandy Ann is wondering if the theater crowd has had any response to the book, and if we're getting special insights to that kind of perspective, say an actor's lens she mentions. Have you been hearing from people in that world about the book?
Yeah, I mean, I know a few people who work in theatre and they've been very positive. That's a tricky one. I don't know. I think there's a lamenting for the lost thing of theatre at the moment. And as I said to you before, Andrea, we've kind of got that back. But I think American readers have been, even in the reviews, there's been a real focus on the experience of going to the theatre. So it's very much not from the actor's point of view. So they might not be so pleased because they're kind of a bit displaced. Everything's projected onto them. I don't consider them at all. But yeah, it's become a kind of evocation of something that's kind of lost for certain readers, which is just I was going to say a lucky coincidence, but not lucky, but just an unexpected reading, just because of what's happened in the world.
How could you have known?
No.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So Marcy asks, Marcy, if you want to ask yourself, indicate somehow. No, okay. What was the hardest and easiest part of this book to write? It's such an unusual concept, viewing a play. What gave you the idea or inspiration for it?
Okay, lots of different things there. I mean, I think the initial sort of little glimmer of inspiration was seeing a play and seeing someone in the audience reacting to it very differently to how other people in the audience were reacting to it. And I just got sort of stuck on this idea of, like many of the things that I talked about with Leslie, the sort of the subjectivity of the communal experience. And in terms of the hardest and the easiest, I had the hardest bit was getting started. I just didn't do it for so long because I was hung up about a lot of things. But the actual writing of it was quite, I loved it. So that was, but I did it in order. So I kind of, when I finished with one character, I would have this kind of despairing horror, you know, that I was never going to be able to get back into the next character because I couldn't leave the previous one behind. So there was the transitions from character to character was the hardest. But I just had to kind of realize at some stage that that was part of my process, that I was going to fall in a heap and get upset, and then I'd do it again. So the next chapter, and then I'd have the same reaction. And I felt very, I was very sad when I finished it. I was very worried about them. I was very, so that was hard, but in a good way.
That's
You
so
can find the transition from talking about the play characters and the viewers difficult.
Oh, the transition from
like when you were in the play as opposed to in the characters viewing the play.
yeah.
You handle that in your mind.
I
haven't
just,
read the book, I'm sorry to say, but I will. It sounds fascinating.
yeah, well, sometimes I started from a line or even a couple of phrase or something like that from the play, and then that would trigger a reminiscence or a whole sort of sequence of thoughts in the character. Or other times there was something that I wanted to explore in the character, and then I would kind of find the appropriate a little moment in the play that I could latch that onto. So it yeah, it was kind of, you know, that thing where you get so wrapped up in, and then you look up and it's still there. So it was kind of a bit like that in the writing process. And like I said with Leslie, it was very structured. So I sort of knew how much space I had, but within those spaces, it goes all over the place. And I did let myself go all over the place. And then I'd be, there's the play again. Come back to, yeah.
Great.
Thank you for the question.
great. Robert wants to know, do you still think about Ivy, Margot, and Summer? Do you know what happens to them next? i.e., is there a sequel?
I do think about them often, and I worry about them a little bit. There's no sequel. Robert knows that. And I wouldn't want to do that. And I wanted to leave it a bit open-ended. And even in my own mind, it's a bit open-ended. I'm not sure. Well, I didn't want it to be completely clear how things all worked out. I didn't kind of do a little epilogue 6 months later and kind of tie it all up and end their stories. So I'm not quite sure what happened to them all. That's what I'm going to say anyway. So, yeah.
Great. And maybe for one last question, just a reflection between the two of you on what it's like to have met the way you did and see each other's work and have this kind of backstage access to how things are built.
Well, I would like to have the opportunity to say something particular about Leslie and how the impact that she had. I came to Denver. It was a very random thing that I just kind of applied to. I hadn't written for years. My first book came out quite a long time ago, and I was in this state of, you know, self-loathing about my writing or my lack of writing, but yet I was still doggedly trying to pursue it. So I found myself in Denver, and there was, and as Leslie said, it was a nonfiction class, and I've never written anything nonfiction. That was the only thing I've ever written, and I only wrote that to get into that class. And I am not, it doesn't come naturally to me. I like the distortions of fiction and the kind of the personal distance. That might change, but there was a particular thing in that class that Leslie said about kind of writing into the discomfort, writing into your, you know, writing the problem sort of. And for me, that wasn't about, you know, that could be actually like a topical way of writing an essay. But for me, that was almost like, well, okay, if I feel like I'm all wrong as a writer, that no one needs a book by me, you know, how about I interrogate that subject position really properly in a novel? How about I just grapple with all the questions around whiteness and privilege and art and loving the things that you love? And, you know, so it was absolutely on that weekend that I just thought, well, I'm never going to write again, or I'm going to just write into my own discomfort. And that's what I got from Leslie. So thank you.
Well, it's, you know, it's so beautiful to think about that idea, which in some ways was, or at least the kernels of that, I feel like the inheritor rather than source of. But one of my great mentors, the writer Charlie D'Ambrosio, who's a fiction writer and essayist, but, you know, he used to tell me sometimes the problem with an essay can become its subject, which is one way of sort of framing that writing into. Although there, you know, I think sometimes, and this really connects to your novel, I think sometimes there's a much more even bodily, like it can feel like a much more visceral thing. Like when you feel the thing that makes your gut clench, you kind of go towards it rather than away from it or something like that. But to think about that idea and how it's played out so beautifully and difficultly in the best ways in this book is really, really, it's powerful to connect those things and you just you do such a wonderful job, I think, of being tender with your characters and also, you know, quite sharp in your interrogations, you know, but both of the novel feels so saturated with both of those modes, a kind of a rigor and an acuity, but also a real care. It doesn't surprise me that you worry about them, because I think that care is also present in each of the pages. So it's thrilling to be able to talk about it with you, to see it behind you. If we had a million more years, I would ask you how you feel about the different covers of the book. I love that one of them is a fire made of art. It's like encapsulating our whole conversation. I've been very lucky with the design in all territories. It's just been a bit of a dream, really.
Well, you guys, it's so lovely that you spent this evening with us, and thank you all for attending. In the chat, I put links to these necessary books that everyone must go out and order. Suddenly I'm very grainy, sorry about that. But anyway, thank you to Leslie, thank you to Claire. We love both of you so much, and your generosity is so appreciated. Everybody go get these books, and we'll see you sooner rather than later.
I put Claire's link in the chat again, so it's right there at the bottom. So everybody before they leave can just click that link right there and go buy a book.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to be here.
So lovely to see you all.
Congratulations, Claire. Thank you.
So stimulating. Thank you, ladies.
Hello.
Unmute yourself and say goodbye.
I'll say happy Easter and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
All the way from
you.
Australia.
Thank you.
What an uplifting evening.